CGTN business anchor Rama Young joins me now to discuss the new Kenyan housing levy. Rama, welcome to the program. Thank you for joining us. A lot going on in Kenya now. Rama, talk to us about the signing into law of this controversial housing levy bill. What has been the reaction from Kenyans across the country, given the fact that the cost of living has been a topic of discussion for the last 6 months?
Well, in a nutshell, not very positive. Because remember, coming into 2024 and 2023, you essentially were dealing with a population that had essentially been looking at, in inflation adjustment terms, their income had been falling, right, from in the decade leading up to 2022. So you already effectively had a much smaller pie, theoretically speaking, of income to deal with at a household level. And now government comes in with the 2023 Finance Act, they try to implement this, and they're essentially taking a bigger piece out of a much smaller pie. So on that basis, it's not been received quite positively. And remember, the effective target base is not that big. Kenya's formal employment base, for lack of a better word, is around 3 million people. That's relatively small, considering the country's population is well over 50 million. So on top of that, there's a couple of structural issues that the bill essentially introduces that have left some analysts asking a lot of questions. So for example, the bill says that in addition to that 1.5% deduction that you're making from the employer and the employee, as an individual, you can then make voluntary contributions, additional savings into the Affordable Housing Fund. But Kenya already has a Kenya Mortgage Refinancing Authority. So the bill says you can use your savings to essentially apply for mortgage from this fund. If that's the case, then why do you have the Kenya Mortgage Refinancing Corporation in place? Because the idea there was to essentially try and bring the cost of credit, which was identified as one of the biggest inhibitors, both on the developer side and on the household side, as to why people aren't owning their own homes. That was one of the big problems. The High Court also essentially argued that the state jumped the gun by introducing this levy without having an effective legal framework, a fund in place to actually manage this money. And the question at the time was, even when the levy was introduced back in June, July last year, at the time everyone was asking, okay, so you're taking 1.5% out of my pocket and taking another 1.5% from my employer, but where's the money going? Where's the accountability? Who's running it? What institution is running it? Now, Kenya does have a national housing corporation that's been on the statute since 1953. That goes back to when Kenya was a colony. It was literally a year after the Kenya emergency started. Now, if you already have a national housing corporation that ideally should be dealing with these issues, why are you then introducing another affordable housing fund? So there's a lot of red tape that this has introduced. But in exchange for that, this is what the government says employers are going to get. They say they're going to provide at least 3 tiers of housing: social housing for anyone who makes less than 20,000 shillings a month, about $1,800 a year; affordable housing for anyone making less than $13,400 a year; and there's another tier on top of that for anyone who's making more than that. But the reality is the average monthly income, the average annual income of this country is around $5,000 or so a year. So the bulk of the demand essentially is going to be left in that specific segment.
All right, Rama, as we further pull the covers off of this bill, a judge, if you would recall, had stopped the deduction, citing a lack of legal framework. But the law now extends the levy to other workers and now requires, listen to this, non-salaried Kenyans in the informal sector to pay the levy. My question to you is, do we know how the government plans to collect the money from those in the informal sector?
That is the billion-dollar question to which no one has an answer. We actually got access to some of the draft of the bills that were essentially sent over to the president for his assent. And in there, essentially, Section 4.2b says that, you know, this levy of 1.5% of your gross income also applies to anyone who is not formally employed. But the question always comes back to, how are you going to implement this, right? If you're an employed person, you essentially have someone else handling payroll, and those payments essentially go to the tax agency, the Kenya Revenue Authority. If you are a short-term consultant, you work on one short-term contract here, one short-term contract there, essentially you'd be making your payments in a very irregular manner. Once my client pays me, then I go off to make the payment to the Kenya Revenue Authority. If you're a pensioner, for example, yes, you've retired, you're past the age of 60, but yes, you're still meaningfully, quote unquote, employed in one sense. You're doing some of these contracts. How exactly are they going to essentially tag you into the income tax system? That's been a question that essentially no one really has a clear answer for, and the bill certainly doesn't. What they could do to try and cure that problem is deal with it through regulations. We haven't seen those regulations yet. Once the law has been gazetted by the Attorney General, then the process of making the regulations will follow after that. But you know, it's a lot easier to essentially net individuals who are in the informal sector through consumption taxes, because if I'm buying a bottle of water, if I'm buying, you know, a loaf of bread, the tax is already filed into the price that I'm paying. But on the income side, it's a billion-dollar question that really, at this point in time, doesn't have a clear answer.
All right, billion-dollar question that doesn't have a clear answer. CGTN business anchor Raman Young, thank you so much for your insight and analysis.